Hey you, this game. I'm concerned about this game, and I want to talk about why. See, my favorite game has changed over and over with time. Twilight Princess, Halo 2, Mario Kart DS, Hollow Knight, Elden Ring, but you know what's never really changed? My favorite franchises. The families of games I can always go back to for perennial nostalgia, and those are Dark Souls, Halo, and Metroid. With regards to the latter, I have watched every single Nintendo Direct for the last 7 years, waiting with bated breath for any scrap, any crumb of news from the table of Daddy Miyamoto about one single game, and now that I have it, I am so scared. Given only the information that we know, I am genuinely concerned that Metroid Prime 4 has been set up for failure, and if it fails, Prime 4 would almost certainly spell the end of Metroid Prime forever. Let's overanalyze the trailer to break down the good, the less good, and why I am worried for Prime's future. Let's finally lay out the score for Metroid Prime 4. Now listen, I know better. I've learned from my mistakes, and that thesis comes off as super negative. Because of that, a majority of this video is actually going to be positive, and I want to kick things off with possibly the greatest improvement Prime 4 has shown us thus far: the UI design. Prime 4's HUD looks absolutely incredible. First of all, it is one of the very few Prime games that actually gets Samus's visor right. Samus's visor in the first game is shaped like this, and Prime 1's HUD reflects that accurately. But for every other subsequent game in the series, she has her iconic visor that's partly inspired by those of the Galactic Federation. Thing is, literally only one game represents this correctly, as Prime 1, 2, and 3 all have HUDs that show Samus with the same concave dome piece that comes down in front of her visor from the top of her helmet. Not only does Prime 4's HUD have the appropriate shape, but by virtue of that, it opens up more room in the center of the screen, giving players a clearer field of view. And speaking of the clearer view, the targeting reticle is now hollow and very slim, as opposed to the larger 4-point reticle from the previous trilogy. A lot of emphasis has gone into making the center line of the screen as open and clear to the player as possible, and opening that center screen means that the outer peripheries are now full of more information than ever. The minimap and the radar in the top corners of the screen have both been improved upon since previous games. The map appears to show more of the surrounding area than it used to, and the radar has a number of changes. For one, it's a lower opacity now, meaning that it's easier to see what's behind it. For two, and almost more importantly, the target acquisition is much better, differentiating between friendly and enemy targets, as well as changing the icon to show when the player is locked onto a specific enemy. And on the topic of locking on, let's talk about the changes to the Scan Visor. In previous games, a symbol would hover over a scannable object that indicated what kind of object that was. In Remastered, this was simplified to having a red or orange rounded square, and in Prime 4, this has been further streamlined. However, where I was not at all a fan of the nondescript rectangles in Remastered, I think Prime 4's changes are actually for the better. Now, every scannable object, be it enemies or the pieces of the environment, are shrouded in a colored glow that makes them stand out. Meanwhile, after you scan them, they turn white, indicating that an object has already been scanned before. Where in previous games, only select objects would look physically different after being scanned, like the Chozo lore walls in Prime 1, now everything is visually distinct, and you no longer have to question if you missed something and spam your scanner all over the place while trying to go for a 100% run. Moving from inside Samus's visor to outside, her new design seems to pull inspiration from all over the Metroid franchise, leaning more toward the modern designs. It seems like they used her Prime 3 design as a base, which makes sense, but then they added details from Other M and even Metroid Dread. From Other M, her arm cannon has details around the elbow on both the top in the player's POV and on the back with the same kind of rounded spike. Going into Other M's suit design makes some sense given that in the very beginning of the trailer, we're told that the game takes place in 20X9. Bear with me, because technically any statement about specific years in the timeline for Metroid is false. The timeline is a huge mess, but generally speaking, it's accepted that 20X is the 2070s. Going with that, hold it, nope, just kidding, we are actually skipping the bit about the timeline. We are not talking about that. What? Why would you do that? Half of it has already been edited. Why? Because I did all this research and all this writing, then I find out that, actually, we beat Prime 3 before 2076, as confirmed in the opening crawl of Federation Force, the only one I didn't play because who did? Whatever. Point is, Prime 4 is going to be taking place around the same time as Super Metroid and shortly before Other M, so it makes sense that her armor's going that direction, and the trailer references Super Metroid a lot. Next! Leaning also into what would become her Dread design later in the story, her breastplate has been swooped back and flattened out. Where in previous games her breastplate would come up and form an armored plate guard around her neck, all of that additional bulk has been shaved away and flattened down to reveal more of her neck and make her head seem less tucked in. But whether you like the stylistic changes inspired by the other games or not, the biggest improvement has to be her iconic shoulder guards. Samus has always had an issue with proportions, namely she is extremely top-heavy. No, not like that. Her physical shoulders would almost always have to be completely dislocated for her armor to look the way that it does. That or she has the broadest shoulders in the galaxy, but fortunately from elsewhere, we know she's not taking the crown from Spire. With the Prime 4 design, her giant pauldrons are more clearly attached to the rest of the suit of armor, rather than having her arms simply come out of the pauldrons. This was done by making them very slightly smaller and showing more gaps between the pauldrons and the other armor pieces, and by virtue of that, showing the undersuit, which tells you exactly where Samus's actual shoulders are. Now, before we move on, I must share a very somber piece of news, as unfortunately, a feature of Samus's armor that has been present for every game in the series has been regrettably removed. I am, of course, referring to the butt armor, which has been nerfed out of existence. On the topic of pulling details from other games, though, let's talk about the Space Pirates. The pirates have gotten a new design in every single Prime game, with the exception of Prime Hunters, which shares the same design with Prime 2. These pirates look like they used the general design of the original Metroid Prime Space Pirates as their base, considering that they have the same color scheme, and they're clearly wearing mechanical armor on top of their actual bodies, rather than having their bodies be spliced into the armor. However, the split-lip design reminiscent of the elites from Halo that they had in Prime 3 returns, except this time looking more insect-like. Nintendo Life actually made a great point and showed that the armor and weapons look very distinctly like their designs from Federation Force, so kudos to him for noticing that. Continuing the trend of pulling from Metroid's history, we get to the lab scene in the trailer. In the lab, we see a few interesting things. First of all, there's an energy tank off to the right with a shiny, or at the very least sparky, new design. Second, when the lab comes into center frame, it looks very reminiscent of the start of Super Metroid, right down to the dead soldiers and researchers after a different pirate raid on a Federation lab. And in the back, we see them wheeling off what is more than likely some kind of plot MacGuffin. I'm assuming it's important to the story, given that one of the space pirates runs for it while ignoring that it's being gunned down by Marines, so it may actually be what the pirates are there for. Also, an interesting detail, the central hologram is an identical image to the black hole event horizon design as shown in the logo. Continuing with Super Metroid though, we get to the introduction of the main man himself, Sylux. Sylux's introduction is interesting for several reasons here. For one, in Prime Hunters, Sylux was actively competing for the ultimate power of the Olympic Cluster against a known space pirate, Weevil. While Sylux actively hates the Galactic Federation and Samus by proxy, he's also had zero issues fighting the space pirates when it's been convenient for him, so presumably they have some kind of tentative alliance, or more than likely, Sylux is using them as muscle for his own agenda, and we're gonna find out what that agenda is later. Personally, I'm really hoping for a return of the other hunters in Prime 4. At the very least, Weevil will have a good reason to be there since the pirates are directly involved again, And maybe there's a chance for Samus to team up with Noxus, since he was fighting for the greater good during Prime Hunters anyway. Plus, Samus seems to have a history of being chill with ice-themed hunters, even if the last one didn't end up super well. I'm sorry for digging that up, that's painful. Back to Sylux. For 2, despite him having hatched and presumably stolen a Metroid from the Federation, what we see around him aren't actually Metroids. These are essentially failed clones made by the space pirates called Mochtroids, which is spelled wrong for some reason because localization be localizing, but we're gonna pretend that it's not. Mochtroids have only appeared in 2 other games, sort of. They appear in Super Metroid and in a game that no one has ever heard of that I actually own, Metroid Prime Hunters First Hunt. It was essentially a tech demo of Prime Hunters for the DS. You know that these are Mochtroids instead of Metroids because the failed Mochtroids only have a single nucleus, while true Metroids will have 3 nuclei. And now, let's get on to the only less good part that I want to talk about in the trailer. Oh god, I'm about to make the Metroid people mad again. I am not a fan of Sylux's redesign. I much prefer his original appearance. But instead of complaining, let's examine what they changed and take a stab as to why. The main thing they changed is that his proportions are very, very different, and I think the reason for this is fairly obvious. Sylux, whoever he is, stole a suit of prototype Federation battle armor modeled after the Chozo tech that Samus wears. This is also why no other hunter in Prime Hunters can turn into a ball of energy that pilots their alt form like Samus can, except Sylux in the Lockjaw form. Given that it's a Federation suit and that the canon Federation is almost exclusively comprised of humans, it's entirely likely that Sylux is actually just a human man, given that he can wear the suit. His original design was not conducive to that, especially when the helmet was way too slim for a human head, so they made our boy thick. A wider and more rounded helmet, a much more masculine waist, and significantly better filled out legs. They probably want to reveal Sylux as originally being a Federation Marine, and they needed to make him more anatomically human for that to be realistic. As for the rest of him though, the suit looks different because it's been 3 or so years since the events of Metroid Prime Hunters, and if Prime 3 or Federation Force are anything to go by, Sylux has been busy. The Delano 7 looks very different between how it looks in Hunters and the secret ending of Prime 3, so it makes perfect sense that he would make modifications to his suit. And now for the part that a lot of you skipped 70% of the video to see. Yes, I see you. Let's talk about the most worrying thing. From the moment that the trailer started, my heart dropped. And this is why. Surprise, surprise, the thing that freaks me out the most has almost nothing to do with what we're shown in the trailer. Being on the Switch is a massive red flag. So let's stop talking games and let's talk business. I, as well as a lot of other people online, subscribe to a fairly strong theory, or at least so we thought. The Switch is publicly at the end of its lifespan. We know that Nintendo is going to announce the next console within the next fiscal year, which on record means hearing about that no later than March 2025. With that being the case, a theory emerged. Prime 4 has taken 5 years since the development restarted in 2019, and now we know it's going to be 6. But Retro managed to make every other Prime game of the trilogy in roughly 2 to 3 years each. Granted, Prime was one of the most infamous development crunch nightmares in gaming history. I've already made a whole video about that, but even still, why would it take Retro, who know Metroid Prime better than anyone, so many years to make Prime 4? And why, when the community has been so publicly desperate for information, has Nintendo said absolutely nothing for 5 years? Well, for starters, the pandemic was a thing, and that absolutely slowed down development. That aside though, the theory was that Metroid Prime 4 was being developed as a launch title for Nintendo's next console. The fact that it would be a fresh dev kit and a new console means that Retro would be taking at least as long as they did when they jumped from GameCube to Wii. The fact that it's an unannounced new console is why Nintendo had been so tight-lipped. Even giving us a screenshot from Prime 4 would tell us something about the fact that it's on a new console and what that console could do. And moreover, the scope of the game is likely to be huge. And why do we assume that Metroid Prime 4 is going to be huge? Well, Nintendo is almost always a generation behind in terms of their console's capabilities, and naturally, the games that you can develop for a given platform are limited by what that platform is capable of doing. The Switch is finally what caught Nintendo up to the Xbox 360 and PS3, being better than both of them, but still worse in most ways than the Xbox One and the PS4. Specifically, the Switch was far worse in one particular way. On top of having literally half of the RAM of the Xbox One or PS4, the Switch only had 32 gigabytes of storage, as opposed to the other two having, what was it? 500! Bearing the capabilities of the Switch in mind and what the previous console leap looked like, we should expect that Nintendo's next console won't have the performance of current gen in 2024, but it should catch up to the Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro. Given this scenario, we are easily set up for not only the best Prime game in the series, but a Prime game unlike anything we've ever seen before. One which takes advantage of all of the super talent that Retro recently onboarded. We're talking people with major roles at Retro who worked on games like the Demon's Souls remake, God of War Ragnarok, Battlefield 5, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and from studios like id, Striking Distance, and Gearbox. 2K resolution at 60 FPS and the wiggle room for them to make the story as expansive as they can imagine. Think about what a 30 to 50 gigabyte Metroid Prime game could do. And most importantly, it's potentially a launch title. The most anticipated Metroid game in history, launching alongside Nintendo's shiny new console as a first-party launch title even before Mario or Zelda, would bring a massive amount of attention to Metroid as a brand and potentially breathe new life into the franchise. If it went well, it would all but guarantee a hopeful future for Metroid going forward, and almost certainly lock in that we get a second Prime trilogy. But instead, now Prime 4 looks very good, but the problem is, it looks very good for the Switch. Take a second and think about it from this perspective. Tears of the Kingdom was 16 gigabytes, which already literally takes up more than half of what a base Switch had access to. And its art style essentially lets it cheat in terms of data. The fact that it's cel-shaded means that you can get away with much lower resolution textures and even lower polygon models. Doing realistic textures, lighting, and models doesn't let you get away with that. So if Metroid Prime 4 looks as good as it does, with the realistic art style that it has, and it's limited to the Switch's storage capacity, something's gotta give somewhere. And that somewhere is almost certainly the game's length. And to top it all off, this shorter, limited version of Prime 4 is going to come out as a swan song game at the very tail end of a console's lifespan when everyone's already looking to spend money on the new console instead. And that breaks my heart, man. Because even if Prime 4 pulls the same thing that Twilight Princess did, and it releases on both consoles, you're only as fast as your slowest runner. Retro is still tied down to the fact that the game has to run at 60 FPS on a base Switch. Metroid is already, and always has been, the least popular of Nintendo's big three. Limiting the scope of what Prime 4 could do while also putting it on a console that's about to be replaced is a recipe for poor sales. And Prime 4 really can't afford to sell badly. if the revival that we have been waiting for as Metroid fans for nearly 20 years doesn't sell well, Nintendo likely will never see a point in putting effort into the Prime series again. And that is why I think Metroid Prime 4 has been set up for failure. Thank you all so much for watching. Man, I hope Prime 4 does well, because it has to. If you're a Metroid fan who made it all the way to the end, please hit that subscribe button. If you want to support me personally, please consider becoming a member or a patron. And until then, I will see you, yes you, next time.